Hello, I am here to bring you my November wrap up. I read and finished 5 books in November, and I wanted to talk with you about them. We're going to go in chronological order. So, the first one I started with was The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. This was not my first Grady Hendrix. This is my second one, I believe. I read Horrorstör. That was the first one of his that I read years and years ago. And I enjoyed this book. I listened to it on audio, and it's about a woman whose name I can't remember, who is a housewife, and she's part of a book club, and they sort of get tired of reading like classics and the novels that you're supposed to read, and they end up reading a lot of true crime, more considered like trashy novels, and they really enjoy them. And then this man comes to town, and we soon find out that he is a vampire. And the main character, this housewife, is really struggling with life, with her husband, with her kids. She's very unhappy in a lot of ways as she's trying to do the best that she can for her family. And then you throw vampires into the mix, and she finds out that there's a vampire, and she's trying to convince other people that vampires exist as well. And I really enjoyed this book. I loved reading it on audio. It was very creepy. It got very dark towards the end. So maybe look up trigger warnings for some things if that's something you think you might be sensitive to. But I loved the themes that this book talked about. Who do we try to protect? What kind of harm do we maybe overlook in our own neighborhoods? How we may not worry about something until it's affecting our inner circle, and we forget that there are other people out there who it's affecting, the people that they care most about, and about standing up for what you believe in and what you think is right, even when people around you are saying that you are crazy, or they don't believe you, or they think you should just stay out of it because it's not affecting you, and maybe you don't need to worry about it and you can just let it happen to other people. So I really like this book. I like the horror elements. Definitely made me want to read some more Grady Hendrix. So I'll be checking out some more of his in the future. Now, this next book, Becoming Elizabeth Elliot, I didn't talk about in any of my vlogs. I read this on ebook because it was the only way I could get it. My libraries didn't have physical copies. This is for my in-person book club with my church, and this is about Elizabeth Elliot, the missionary, and kind of how she became the woman she was in her later years. She was writing books, and kind of what happened to her from childhood all the way up until, she was kind of settled after doing missions work in the US and writing books. This is by Ellen Vaughn. So I loved Ellen Vaughn's voice in this book. I think she did a really great job of telling us who Elizabeth Elliot was, and not putting her on a pedestal, kind of looking at her with a very balanced view of, maybe she was a little off in some of the ways of her thinking. She grew up in a very strict Christian household. She went to a very strict Bible college. She had some maybe over-the-top views that weren't necessarily easy for other people to follow, but she kind of thought everyone should be following those things. She was a very serious woman. She did not let her feelings show very much. She could come off as kind of cold to some people, but she had a tremendous love for people. She just struggled to show it. Elizabeth Elliot kind of reflected, and maybe that was due to her upbringing, like her family, they weren't, lovey-dovey, hugging, kissing, telling each other how much they loved each other. But she was an amazing, studious, biblically centered woman. One of the most profound things that I found in this book is how she For those of you who don't know, her husband, Jim Elliot, they had traveled to South America to try to preach the gospel to a native tribe there, and the natives there ended up murdering her husband and a few other missionaries who were there, and she actually ends up years later taking her daughter and going and living with the very same people. She talked at one point in the book about how there was a picture of one of the men who had killed her husband, like holding her daughter's hand. And she was like, I don't understand how I can love these people after what they did. And it was so powerful because in her grief and despair, she always talked about, you know, what does God want? What is he trying to do? And she would say time and time again, I don't understand. I miss my husband. I thought God wanted us here. And it was just a really powerful testimony. Like, I don't know how you would do that. Like, how you would not harbor this, like, hatred towards these people who had murdered her husband, and also towards God who had let that happen when her husband was just trying to preach the gospel like God called him to do. So I just think she has a really powerful testimony, but I liked that Elizabeth Vaughn didn't like put her up on this pedestal as like someone who is above humanity. It's like, no, she was a very flawed woman. She did struggle with knowing what God was doing. She struggled with just wanting the earthly things we want, like her husband, back. And she struggled with frustration at other people she was working with. There was this one woman who they butt heads and they just could not get along. And it was really good to see the human struggles alongside like her beautiful sacrifice and dedication to God and his ministry. So I really, really enjoyed that book, and it was really great. The next book I read was A Sorceress Comes to Call, and I have a standalone review of this. If you want to check that out, it's up here, I believe in this corner. And I love T. Kingfisher. She's one of my favorite authors, and I just think that she's so criminally underrated. Her novels are easy to read. They're funny. They're interesting. They have not your typical female main characters. And I just think that everyone should give her novels a try. This one in particular is a retelling of Goose Girl. It's a very loose retelling, I think. And in the beginning of this novel, we have this young girl, she's a teenager, Cordelia, whose mother is very unhinged. She's very unstable. Her emotions swing wildly. Cordelia never knows when her mom is going to get mad at her for doing something simple like closing a door. Her mom is paranoid that Cordelia is like keeping secrets from her or planning things. And we find out in the very opening pages that her mother can like take control of people's bodies. So Cordelia will be able to feel everything that's happening to her, but she can't move her body, she can't speak, and her mother can like control her. And it's a very creepy opening reading about that. It's very, very creepy. And this novel does hold some slight horror elements. It's not horror per se. It's not going to be like a scary novel, but there are some very creepy things that happen. At the same time, T. Kingfisher always weaves in a little bit of humor and light with her characters. They're very lovable, a lot of them, except for the ones you're supposed to hate. Hester is an older woman that Cordelia comes across because her mother is trying to marry the squire. The squire has a sister named Hester who is not so sure about Cordelia's mom. She kind of sees the danger of her, sees her as an enemy, and also wants to take care of Cordelia, who she sees as very nervous. She can tell this child has not been taken care of, and Hester is this older woman in her 50s. She's not your typical hero who's like, I'm gonna like take someone on with my fists, but she's very smart. She's very determined to help as best she can, even though she's like, I don't really know what to do. and I just really appreciated her. She was like the star of the book for me. And T. Kingfisher writes a lot of older female main characters, which I really enjoy in her books, and she always laces them with humor. The next book I read, I listened to on audio, and this was another hit for me. This is The Unheard by Nikki French. Nikki French is one of my favorite thriller writers. It's a husband and wife duo, and I don't hear them talked about enough. I feel like everyone should be obsessed with them because they write the most creepy thrillers I've ever read. Their Frida Klein series is how I first started reading them, and I love that series. And I've loved a lot of their standalones just as well. I've only read one that I think I've just been okay on. Everything else I've really enjoyed. This one was no exception. This was a 5-star read. In this book, we're following a woman who has a young daughter, and she and her ex-partner have been separated for about a year, and they share custody of the daughter. So usually he'll take Poppy on the weekends. And one weekend, Poppy comes back from her partner's house and her ex-partner's house, and she's swearing. She seems very frightened. She wets the bed. She thinks her mom is going to punish her for wetting the bed, and her mom is like, what happened? Like, something is up. And the rest of the story is all about this woman trying to figure out what's going on with her daughter. Her daughter isn't old enough to tell her right out what's happening. And she's trying not to like scare her daughter, and also not to put like thoughts in her head, because children are so impressionable that you can easily lead them with questions to an answer that you want, and they're just trying to tell you what they want. So she's trying to figure out what is going on. She thinks it might be something happening with her ex-partner, or something that he maybe exposed her to. It just is so creepy. The ending of this, the last like 30% or so, I was on the edge of my seat. If you watch my reading vlog, I was plowing through a puzzle because I just didn't want to stop listening to it, and so I just kept going and going on my puzzle and ended up finishing it. This is a 5-star. This is my favorite kind of psychological thriller. It's a great listen. The woman that does the audiobooks for Nikki French is fabulous. The last completed novel that I read this month was The Seven Sisters by Lucinda Riley. This is in the same reading vlog that I read The Unheard. I read this one. This is a novel all about these 7 sisters who have been adopted by this man called Pa Salt. At the beginning of this book, Pa Salt dies, and he leaves a little mystery for each of the sisters, telling them about their origin, where he adopted them from. This story follows the oldest sister, Maya, as she travels to Rio de Janeiro and gets to learn the story of her great-grandmother, Isabella. This book has probably more of Isabella's story than it does Maya's. This book has to do a lot of setup of a lot of characters in order to introduce the 6 sisters, and then also Pa Salt's death, and then get Maya on her journey. So unfortunately, we don't really get to know Maya a lot. Her story is kind of glossed over. Things move very quickly through her story, and we spend a lot of time with Isabella. This book is not perfect. There definitely were some struggles with it. I felt the story was a little simple. Like, there is a love triangle that pops up at one point, and it's kind of like almost like a false struggle is kind of put up to us, where it's obvious who the right choice is, which I always find frustrating. There's a bit of insta-love. There is some very questionable things towards the end with neurodivergence, where it's basically saying this person is horrible because they may be neurodivergent, which was awful, and it was kind of like a throwaway comment, but really was quite jarring and unnecessary, and I really didn't like how Lucinda Riley was like talking about autism in that way. I really hated that. So this book is like a 2.5 stars. There are things that I did enjoy about it, and I am planning to read the second book because I own it. And we'll see from there whether I continue, but I would say this is a very simplistic story. There's nothing too shocking. I did like some of the things that happened with Isabella's story. I thought Maya's story was fine, but it was a bit simple and everything kind of wrapped up a little too perfectly at the end for my liking. And then I read a bit in Rhythm of War. I'm still not finished with this one, but I am now about 465 pages through. I'm over the 1/3 mark, so that's great. I think I'm like 34% of the way through. So I'm definitely getting there. This is going to be a priority read for December for sure, but I was glad I was able to, read a couple hundred pages in here and get some more progress. So that is all I have for you. If you have read any of these books, please tell me what you thought about them. And I would love to know what your favorite book was that you read in November. I'm always looking for more recommendations and love chatting about books. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.